One of these days I'll get used to that little pop-up and be ready for it. Well, here we go, folks. We're kind of in the meat of all of this. We've been looking at this arc of Jesus's ministry. And as we saw last week, he's starting to shift gears now, and his focus is more going to be on his disciples and on what's to come. So who would like to start in chapter 7 with 1 through 9, please?
Oh, I've got it.
Go for it, Diane.
After this, Jesus went around in Galilee, purposely staying away from Judea because the Jews there were waiting to take his life. But when the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles was near, Jesus' brothers said to him, "You ought to leave here and go to Judea so that your disciples may see the miracles you do. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you are doing these things, show yourself to the world." For even his own brothers did not believe in him. Therefore, Jesus told them, "The right time for me has not yet come. For you, any time is right. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify that what it does is evil. You go to the feast. I am not yet going up to this feast, because for me the right time has not yet come." Having said this, he stayed in Galilee.
Thanks. A couple interesting things in here. First of all, just starting on the timing of it. John kind of marks time by the various feasts that take place. Here we're coming up on the Feast of Tabernacles. In other words, this would be fall. This would be about 6 months before Passover, 6 months before Jesus is crucified. He knows that. He knows when his time will be. And so we're going to see a couple of different themes that are going to run through here. And the first one is in verse 6, when he says, "The right time has not yet come." Jesus is in control of this situation all the way up until his death, when he gives up his spirit. He's not going to go any sooner or any later than what has been arranged. John is going to hammer that point home using that little phrase, "the time had not yet come." We've seen him a little bit earlier following the feeding of the 5,000, when he just walked away from the crowd and went off to be by himself because he knew the crowd wished to make him king by force. That's not his plan. That's not what he's come to do. So he simply walks away. And John is going to point out several times in this rest of his book here how Jesus simply walked away, avoided things because the time was not yet come. What I find fascinating here is his brothers were in kind of a mocking mode. They didn't believe in him. And so as this time for the feast is coming, they knew Jesus had to go. There's 3 feasts that required journeys to Jerusalem, Tabernacles being one of them. And so they're kind of poking him, saying, "Go on, go show your miracles off to your followers. You don't want to stay back here and do things in private. Go be the star of the show. Anybody who wants to be a public figure doesn't stay in hiding." And Jesus's response was simply, "Go ahead, you go. I'm not ready yet. It's not the time for me to go." However, who would like to read verses 10 through 13 for me? Go for it, Joanne.
Later, when his brothers had gone to the festival, he went up himself, not publicly, but almost in secret. The Jews were looking for him at the festival and asking, "Where is he?" And there was much whispering about him in the crowds. "He is a good man," said some. "No," said others, "he is leading the people astray." However, no one talked about him openly for fear of the Jews.
Thanks. I love that part. Nope, I'm not going. You go. And then as soon as they're gone, he turns around and goes. But he was going to do it on his terms. He wasn't going to let anybody, including his brothers, tell him what to do. And that's really kind of the point in all of that discourse, was that, nope, I'm doing this on my time, not yours. But he didn't come in publicly. He was kind of hanging back. And I kind of look at it as he's reading the room to see what people are saying. And we've seen all along that there's been this division amongst people trying to figure out who he is. Some people think he's a good teacher. Some people think he's the prophet to come. Some people think he's evil incarnate. He's demon possessed. Nobody is really quite sure who he is. And they're talking in small groups and in quiet because they were afraid. What do you think they were afraid of?
Well, if they were involved with him, they'd be in danger too.
Yeah.
Think how different things would be if he had gone and been killed at this festival instead of when he was supposed to be.
But he wasn't going to be killed at this festival because it wasn't time. Because he did show his face. And it's going to be an interesting response when he does make an appearance. People have been torn about who Jesus is for the last 2,000 some years. It's no different today. There are many people who keep their faith private. They keep it inside or in small groups because they're afraid of what other people will think or say about them. I don't want to be known as one of those Christians. I don't want to offend anybody. My faith is personal, it's private. All the excuses in the world. 2,000 years and nothing has changed, folks. Jesus still has this impact on people because A, we're not really sure, and B, we're either ashamed or afraid. I'm going to leave it at that because that's going to go down a whole nother rabbit hole about what that truly says about that person. But suffice it to say, nothing's new. Our reaction publicly to Jesus today is no different than it was when he came into town that day. They were simply afraid. Who would like to read 14 through 20 for me? Ellen, go for it.
About the middle of the festival, Jesus went up into the temple and began to teach. The Jews were astonished at it, saying, "How does this man have such learning when he has never been taught?" Then Jesus answered them, "My teaching is not mine, but he who sent me. Anyone who resolves to do the will of God will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own. Those who speak on their own seek to their own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and there is nothing false in him. Did not Moses give you the law? yet none of you keeps the law. Why are you looking for an opportunity to kill me?" The crowd answered, "You have a demon. Who is trying to kill you?" But Jesus answered them, "I perform one work, and all of you are astonished." I think is that it? Yeah.
Now let's keep going through 24, please.
Okay. "Moses gave you the circumcision. It is, of course, not from Moses, but from the patriarchs. And you can circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, in order that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because I healed a man's whole body on the Sabbath? Do not judge me. Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment."
Thanks.
So
Can
he,
you hear?
oh, I'm sorry.
I lost his audio.
Can you hear me?
Now,
Okay. Okay. When Jesus did show up, he shows up in the temple courts and starts to teach. And the people were amazed. Now, they understood a couple of things about him. Number one, he had a power and a wisdom about him that nobody else had. He taught in a way that the Pharisees simply couldn't. And they also knew that he hadn't gone to the right schools. Had he gone to rabbinical school, had he studied under a Pharisee, it would have been public knowledge and everybody would have known, because people who did that went out of their way to let everybody know that I studied under so-and-so, or I studied under so-and-so. Jesus didn't do that. He didn't need to do that, because his teaching wasn't from a human school. His teaching came from God. And he's going to spend some time in this next section here talking about this relationship between he and the Father. And it's going to go right over everybody's head. They're not going to understand it. In fact, at the end, they're going to get a little angry. But what he's saying here is that my teaching isn't my own. I'm only bringing you what I've been taught by the Father. Now, if I was doing this on my own, I would be doing this strictly to gain honor for myself. But that's not my point here, folks. I'm doing this to honor God. They did not understand. And now he's going to take this opportunity to kind of poke at them a little bit more. What we're going to see here is from here to really the end, Jesus is going to be going on the attack against the religious leaders, especially the Pharisees. He's doing that for a couple of reasons. Number one, he wants to show their hypocrisy. He wants to show the people that the folks you've been following don't understand what they're talking about. But secondly, he also knows that he is going to have to get them mad enough that they're going to kill him. So he keeps going at him and going at him. And eventually, when you keep getting attacked, you're going to want to do something to fight back. And now understand the image that the Pharisees had of Jesus. They didn't know where he came from. They didn't know his background. They knew he hadn't been educated in the same schools that they were. He hung out with the people that they saw as being sinners. He did all of the wrong things. He healed somebody on the Sabbath. He was doing things that they couldn't do. They had known that that invalid by the pool had been there for decades and did absolutely nothing about it because they couldn't. So here comes this guy into their religious system, mocking them, kind of poking at them, saying and doing things that they can't say and do. What is their reaction supposed to be?
Anger.
Anger. Yeah. And that's the result. He takes this opportunity to start pointing out the hypocrisy of the religious leaders. They were angry at him for healing the invalid on the Sabbath. Remember back to that story when Jesus says, pick up your mat and walk, and the guy does, and shows up into the temple, and the Pharisees are angry at him because he's, quote unquote, working on the Sabbath. He's carrying his mat. They weren't happy that he'd been healed. They condemned him for breaking the law, the Mosaic law that said you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Although technically Moses, when he received the 10 Commandments, basically just said, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. That's what God had said. It was the Jewish religious leaders that defined what it meant to work on the Sabbath. I think we said there was 113 different rules that they had made up about what it meant to work on the Sabbath. And carrying your mat was one of them. God never said to not carry your mat on the Sabbath. Man did. But they accused him of breaking Moses' law. And they accused Jesus of not keeping the Sabbath because he dared to heal somebody. And Jesus points out here and says, okay, we'll talk about this. You want to get deep and philosophical about this? Okay, here it is. You're telling me I can't heal somebody on the Sabbath, but yet you are willing to break that Sabbath restriction yourselves to try to, quote unquote, do the right thing. When a child is born, the Mosaic law said you're supposed to circumcise them on the 8th day. Well, you can see that every once in a while, that 8th day is going to fall on a Sabbath.
Mhm.
Yet instead of doing it early or doing it late, they went ahead and did it on the Sabbath because that's what the law said they're supposed to do. And Jesus says, it's okay for you to break the law, but me, I healed the entire man. I didn't just perform a little surgical ritual to uphold the law. I healed the entire person. And you're accusing me of breaking the law. He's showing how hypocritical the religious leaders are. Now, I don't claim to know everything in the world, but I know a few things. And one of them is religious leaders don't like to be called hypocrites, especially the more entrenched you are in thinking your belief is right. And so when somebody comes along that you already don't like and respect, comes along and says you're a hypocrite, yeah, it's setting this thing up for failure. But Jesus doesn't care. He doesn't care. He's going to get his jabs in while he can because he's got a greater purpose in mind. They don't understand it, but he does. So who would like to read verse 25 through 31 for me? Vita? Oh,
I
Susan.
can. Susan. I'll do the next one after Susan.
Okay, I thought I saw your hand go up. Sorry.
Some of the people of Jerusalem therefore said, is not this man the man whom they seek to kill? And here he is speaking openly, and they say nothing to him. Can it be that the authorities really know that this is the Christ? Yet we know where this man comes from, and when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from. So Jesus proclaimed, as he taught in the temple, you know me, and you know where I come from. But I have not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know. I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me. So they sought to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him, because his hour had not yet come. Yet many of the people believed in him. They said, when the Christ appears, will he do more signs than this man has done?
Thanks. Thanks. The people are amazed that Jesus has the gall to stand up publicly and teach. They know that he's kind of seen as an enemy of the church. And yet here he is speaking publicly, and no one's doing a thing to stop him. But what's happening is now people are starting to question, who is this guy? Is he really the Messiah? Is he the Christ? And then they're starting to go back into their heads again and think, well, no one's supposed to know where the Christ comes from, which isn't true, by the way. Scripture kind of makes it clear where it's going to happen from. But they're, on one hand, spiritually kind of excited. But then on the other hand, they're intellectually trying to talk themselves out of it, which is going to be a pattern through this whole rest of the book. And we've seen that all along, where Jesus is saying something in a spiritual plane and the people are only seeing it on the physical or the literal plane. And what John is trying to highlight here is that that's kind of a normal human reaction. Logically, Jesus doesn't make sense. It really doesn't. But on a spiritual level, Jesus makes perfect sense. And he's going to go on and talk about that same concept here for the next couple of 3 chapters, about how Jesus has a different agenda than the people are anticipating. Jesus is starting to make it very clear who he is, but the people aren't understanding. Who would like to read 32 through, oh, let's go to 44, excuse me. Vita, go for it.
The Pharisees heard the crowd thus muttering about him, and the chief priests and Pharisees sent officers to arrest him. Jesus then said, I shall be with you a little longer, and then I go to him who sent me. You will seek me, and you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come. The Jews said to one another, where does this man intend to go, that we shall not find him? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks? What does he mean by saying, you will seek me and you will not find me, and where I am, you cannot come? On the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and proclaimed, if anyone thirst, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart shall flow rivers of living water. Now this he said about the Spirit, which those who believed in him were to receive. For as yet the Spirit had not been given, because Jesus was not yet glorified. When they heard these words, some of the people said, this is really the prophet. Others said, this is the Christ. But some said, is the Christ to come from Galilee? Has not the scripture said that the Christ is descended from David and comes from Bethlehem, the village where David was? So there was a division among the people over him. Some of them wanted to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him.
Thanks. This part is taking place on the last day of the feast. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles celebrated the journey of the Israelites out of Egypt through the wilderness and to the Promised Land. It was called Tabernacles because, well, they had the tent that everybody would come to worship in, that portable tabernacle. They also had little small tents that the people were living in. So it was, the Feast of Tents, the Feast of Booths. Basically, it was celebrating the journey. And they did it in many different ways. They would have a torchlight parade to celebrate being led by the pillar of fire at night through the wilderness. And Jesus is going to touch on that in a little bit. One of the other things they did was they would pour water out in the temple. They would do that as part of their regular worship anyway during this time. But on the last day was where they celebrated Moses getting water from the rock. So they poured even more water out. And it's with that as a background that Jesus stands up and says in a loud voice, if anyone's thirsty, let them come to me. And they'll have streams of living water will pour out of them. I love the theatrics of all of that. Jesus quite often used ordinary things to talk about extraordinary things. He would use sheep to talk about being the shepherd. He would talk about the harvest. Things that the people understood, he would turn and use to proclaim God's truth. Where else have we heard him talk about streams of living water, and if you're thirsty, come to him?
Where was that?
Samaritan.
The Good
The Samaritan
Samaritan.
woman, yes.
Oh.
Yes. The Samaritan woman. This is one of those really interesting things in John's writing style. I've talked about it a couple of different times, how he will use this technique that was really prominent in Hebrew poetry. And he would take an event and highlight it. And then sometimes again later, he would take that event and highlight it. And they served as like parentheses or brackets. And so he's saying, this is an important event because I'm talking about it twice. But what he's also saying is that everything that comes in between those two highlighting of the event is kind of taken as a separate entity. And everything that has happened between talking to the Samaritan woman and showing up at the temple is really having to do with the people. And this is kind of where Jesus starts to make that separation. And John is using a literary technique to show us that that's what he's doing. All of that stuff that we've been talking about since Jesus met with the woman at the well is taken as this chunk of his ministry. The teachings, the miracles, and all of the stuff that he's been doing. And what John is really getting at here is now we're going to set all of that aside and we're going to focus on what Jesus is doing from this point forward. It's all under the shadow of those events that had taken place. But this is a natural point of shifting gears.
Oh.
And I love how he uses that technique to highlight this. Everybody with me on that? He does it a few other times in the book, but to me, this is one of the most prominent places that he does it. But he's also using this as an opportunity to talk about what's to come. And that's really what this shift in focus is for Jesus. He's going to be confronting the religious leaders. He's going to be training up his disciples to take his place. And he's really setting the stage for the church to come after he's gone. And one of the things that's going to empower that church is the Holy Spirit. And so here he's talking about that. The people don't understand that. Not yet. They will. But in essence, what he's saying here is that you come and you put your trust in me, and you're going to be different because there's going to be something in you that's going to flow out of you that is going to help you to understand all of this stuff. But right now, all it's doing is confusing everybody. Because they don't know who he is. Is he the prophet? We talked about how the Jews were waiting for the quote unquote prophet to show up before the Messiah. Others are saying, well, maybe he's the Messiah, but no, we know that the Messiah is not going to come out of Galilee. He's supposed to come from Bethlehem, out of the line of David. It's very clear that Jesus had done that. Did they bother to ask him? No. Rather than seeking the truth, they simply made their own assumptions. But again, no one laid a hand on him. His time had not yet come. So who would like to read 45 through 52 for me? Catherine, go for it.
Finally, the temple guards went back to the chief priests and Pharisees, who asked them, "Why didn't you bring him in?" "No one ever spoke the way this man does," the guards declared. "You mean he has deceived you also?" the Pharisees retorted. "Has any of the rulers or of the Pharisees believed in him? No, but this mob that knows nothing of the law, there is a curse on them." Nicodemus, who had gone to Jesus earlier and who was one of their own number, asked, "Does our law condemn anyone without first hearing him to find out what he is doing?" They replied, "Are you from Galilee too? Look into it, and you will find that a prophet does not come out of Galilee."
Thanks. You see what the Pharisees really think about the people. These guys don't know anything. The temple guards had gone to arrest Jesus, but they couldn't. And they come back and empty-handed, and they're kind of trying to explain why. It's like, this guy's a really good teacher. He's saying stuff we've never heard before. And the Pharisees get a little upset. It's like, oh, so now you're a believer too? You guys don't know what you're talking about. And then Nicodemus, who was a Pharisee, remember Nicodemus, the guy way back in the beginning who showed up at night? He kind of calls him on it. Says, we can't condemn this guy. Our law says we can't. We have to first listen and talk to him and find out what he's doing. And their response, rather than saying, you know, Nick, you're right, we shouldn't jump the gun, they just simply say, oh, so now you're one of them too. And then they try to show how smart they are and say, look into it, you'll find a prophet doesn't come out of Galilee. Well, they're wrong, because Jonah came out of Galilee. Vita, did you have a question?
Yeah. Actually, I've got something to share. I have an interesting footnote about verse 52. It says that this is sarcasm expressing the contempt of Jerusalem aristocrats for Galilean peasants.
Yep.
I never knew that that's how they regarded people from Galilee.
Oh, we'd still do the same thing today.
Oh.
If we're from the big city, we look down on people that are from smaller towns or out in the country. There's a reason why they consider the Midwest flyover country. We're not the East Coast. We're not the West Coast. We're just a bunch of bumpkins out here. And that's the same thing. That's how they viewed anybody from Galilee. And what I love about it is those are the people that Jesus chose to be his followers and the ones to carry on when he's gone. He's deliberately standing up in the face of the religious elite and saying, oh, watch this. You didn't think I was worthy? Well, look at these guys. They're from the same cloth as me. He's going to do anything and everything he can to kind of poke at them. But we're starting to see here that they are getting so riled up, talking about their quote unquote precious law, trying to show that they are the ones who understand scriptures. And in their answer, don't even recognize that they're wrong. Look it up, guys. No prophet comes out of Galilee. Well, yeah, they do. Yes, Catherine.
I see I missed one verse because I have a space there. It says 53. Then each went to his own home.
Yep.
I'm sorry.
No, because I deliberately wanted to stop at 52.
Oh,
As we're
okay.
coming into chapter 8, really starting in 753 through 811. Now, this gets tricky, and I want you to bear with me here. This is that discourse, the section where the Pharisees bring a woman caught in adultery to Jesus and say, our law says stone her. They were doing this as a test to see, was Jesus going to go against the law of Moses, or was he going to go against the Romans? They were trying to trap him here. Now, where it gets tricky is when we look at this from a scholarly, historical point of view. Trying to simplify this as best I can without going down a scholar rabbit hole. We did not just have the Bible fall out of the sky and say, here it is. The New Testament, especially the Gospels, were gathered. They were written in Greek with some Aramaic interspersed. And then compiled to come up with the New Testament as we have it. But especially the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were kind of the standalone grouping of the life of Jesus. We do not have one of those original Gospels. We have copies that the closest one is Mark comes to about 40 years after it would have been written. And when we look at things from a literary critical point of view, obviously the original is the most accurate. The further away we get from that original manuscript, you start to bring in questions about how accurate is it. 40 years is pretty gosh darn close when we're looking at a 2,000-year gap here. But that's as close as we come. But the earliest complete manuscripts that we have of John, the ones that are the closest to his actual gospel, don't have this section in them. Yes, Susan.
In my Bible, this whole section is a footnote.
Mm-hmm.
It's in small text.
Yep.
It's not even in the regular font. So,
yep.
Starting where? Starting where?
at 753 all the way through 11, because
Yep.
and I didn't realize that until I looked up and I said, okay, 8 started with 12.
Oh, mine does too. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, now
So-
mine doesn't, Susan. That's interesting. I thought you and I had the same version.
Mine
Some
starts at
ver-
1.
Some versions have it as a footnote. Some versions have it, like mine has a line
Mm.
after verse 52, 51 or 52, and then says this isn't included in some of the earliest manuscripts.
That's what I have.
Mine has another note that introduces it. It says other ancient authorities add 753 to 811, either here or at the end of this gospel or after Luke 21:38 with variations of the text.
Yep. And that was going to be my next thing, is historically scholars and scribes have said this is a legitimate story ascribed to Jesus. They just didn't know where it fit. It's kind of like if you've ever had a book fall apart and the pages weren't numbered. You're trying to figure out where that page goes. There's arguments for and against putting it here. It's shown up in Luke. It's shown up in a couple of other different places in John. One of the popular places was to have it at the end as a footnote for the entire thing. It
Mine's
also
at the
makes
end.
sense to have it at the end of Luke because the language is a little bit different than John. The language, the Greek used in this section is more like Luke's writing than John's. I don't want to get us all sidetracked as to where it should go or not, but I wanted to point it out because sometimes your Bibles are going to say different things. And I wanted to take a little time to teach on why that happens. This is one of those questions that have caused people to invalidate all of Scripture. Basically saying, well, this was inserted at a later date by those guys in Rome trying to figure out how they can oppress people. The reality is it's not about oppressing people. It's about pointing out the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. That's why it shows up here in most modern Bibles, because it goes along with Jesus's teaching about the hypocritical nature of the Pharisees. So we got a little bit of time. Let's go with read basically chapter 8. They've all gone to their own home. So who would like to read 8 to 11 through verse 11?
Want to go around again?
Okay, Diane, go for it.
Okay, then each went to his own home. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin."
Thanks. Fascinating story. What I find really fascinating is they only brought the woman. It takes
I
two to
noticed.
adulterate.
Yeah. So was there no punishment for the men? I'm just going to ask.
It was supposed to be the same thing.
Ah, okay.
The man and the woman were supposed to be stoned. They were supposed to be put to death for committing adultery. But funny, the Pharisees only brought the woman. There's a whole lot of reasons why people think that happened. But they're simply using this. They don't care about her. They're using this to trap Jesus. This is a trick question. He is being set up here. If he says to not stone her, then they can accuse him of not following the law of Moses. And it would be a valid accusation. If he says to stone her, then they can use it against him, because now you're proclaiming that she should die, and only Rome can say that. Only the Romans had the right to put somebody to death. So whichever way he answered, he was going to be in trouble. They didn't count on his third way. And I love, while they're going through all this machination of making this big ordeal about this woman, he just kind of kneels down on the ground and writes in the dust. And then he says, whoever's without sin, throw the first stone. And he kneels down and writes in the dust again. There's been a lot of speculation about what he was writing. I just think it's really kind of neat that that was his response. But I think, for me, one of the most powerful explanations of what he was doing is found back in Jeremiah. Let me read Jeremiah 17:13. Jeremiah is lamenting the fact that Israel has turned away from God. He's bringing God's words to the people, and especially to the religious leaders. And he said, "O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust, because they have forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water." What Jeremiah was saying is that the people who turn their back on the Lord, he used that phrase, names will be written in the dust. In other words, they're going to be written off. They aren't going to be included in the people. And to me, one of the most fascinating explanations is that's what Jesus was doing. He was writing down the names of all of those Pharisees who've come accusing this woman because they're rejecting him. And then he says, whoever's without sin, throw the first stone. So he puts it back on them. And now they start to walk away. The oldest walk away first. And I think it's because the oldest have been around long enough to know that they've got a whole lot of sin. And it's the younger people who are still kind of sort of cocky and arrogant, that after they're sitting there watching everybody else walk away, all of their colleagues walk away, they're going, yeah, that's me too. But Jesus doesn't condemn her. He says, I don't condemn you either. Go and leave your life of sin. Jesus offers forgiveness, which is a foreshadowing of what he has come to do. The Pharisees want to condemn people to death based on the law of Moses. And Jesus is going to point out in a little bit that you guys can't keep the law. You think you can. You think you're going to be saved by it, but you can't. And Jesus is saying there's another way of God's grace. It's simply to trust in him, that he can forgive sins, which is precisely what he's doing here. Does that make sense, folks? Yeah.
Sure does.
That to me is why I think that this story belongs here. Just the way John has set up his gospel or not. Whether it was written by John, written by Luke, I don't know. I don't care. What I do know is this is a very powerful statement of the Lord separating himself once again from the Pharisees and their way of judging, and making that proclamation that I can forgive sin. And that's where we're going to stop today, folks. So a lot to think about, but I wanted to go down the little scholarly rabbit hole because so many people have questions about that, and they use this as an opportunity to simply say, well, if that was an insertion, what else has been inserted? And there are a few other things in the scriptures that have been inserted, but they're always highlighted, and it's always pointed out that we're not absolutely 100% certain where this goes or where it came from, but it belongs here. Kind of like when I'm cleaning out my junk drawer. Nita, I had a question first.
And I hope I'm not the only one. Could you just clarify again? So the Pharisees brought this woman to Jesus who was caught in adultery. They did it to test him. I understand that only the Romans had the right to put somebody to death. What if Jesus had said, yes, she's... So what was the other option to stoning, not to stone, and then he would disobey the Pharisees' laws? Is that how
Yep.
this?
Yep.
Okay.
If he said not to stone her, they could accuse him of breaking the law of Moses.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Diane?
I need to do more work on being written in the dust. Can you tell me what that quote, where that citation from Jeremiah is?
17:13.
Okay, thanks. I'll work on it.
And that again is just me echoing what other commentators have said throughout the years.
Mm-hmm.
Don't take it as fact, fiction, or truth. It's
It
just,
makes sense. I mean, I think it makes sense. I'm not sure I understand.
I think it makes sense. I think, and even if it doesn't make sense, it's a really cool analogy. It kind of
Same
goes,
words anyway.
it goes along with him standing in the temple when they're pouring out all that extra water, talking about streams of living water.
Yeah.
It fits his style. Is that it,
Thank
folks?
you. Thank you for going
Yeah.
down that rabbit hole.
That was very worthwhile. I certainly never got that much out of that those verses before. Thank you.
We like
You're welcome.
rabbit holes.
Rabbit holes, I could go down. In this section of John, there's probably a dozen rabbit holes to go down,
Yeah.
but I don't have 2 years to teach it. Or maybe I do, I don't know. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thanks.
Thank
You
you.
too.
You
Thank
too.
you. Thank you.